So, hello and welcome to this International Transport Forum Ask the Author webinar on greening micromobility. You're all very welcome. And this is a quick fire presentation of our latest ITF Corporate Partnership Board report, which is a revamp of a report from 2020 called Good to Go, assessing the environmental impact of new mobility. I'm joined by the lead authors of that report again today, who 4 years later, with an increased evidence-based analysis and data, are bringing a clearer picture about how green micromobility is. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Pierpaolo Cazzola, who is a former ITF colleague, of course, and now director of the European Transport and Energy Research Center at ITF Davis, the University of California, Davis, and Philippe Crist, who's ITF's advisor on innovation and foresight. So this is our latest corporate partnership board report. Corporate partnership is our mechanism for engaging with the private sector and advancing transport policy advice with a business perspective. So after a 10-minute presentation from the lead authors, it'll be over to you to send us your questions. Please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window. If you're seeing us on social media, on LinkedIn or on our YouTube channels, and you want to ask us a question, please use the link in the event description. Join us on Zoom, and we'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible in a short time frame. So without further ado, over to you, Philippe, who's going to kick off the presentation.
All right, thank you, Ronan. And as Ronan has said, this is an update of work that we did in 2020 when the evidence base, at least for shared micromobility, was quite slim. At the same time, we also looked at the safety of micromobility in 2020. We've released a companion report to this one called Safer Micromobility, also available on the website, looking at those aspects. But today we're going to focus on the life cycle environmental performance of micromobility. Now, we are interested in micromobility because it broadens the options that people have to travel around cities and towns. It is a way of maybe reducing the necessity of having to only rely on one mode of transport, in many areas, the car. It also makes a car light lifestyle easy. And in many cases, we have believed that it will improve the environmental performance of urban travel. And of course, it can do this if both the vehicles, their production, and the servicing of at least of the shared vehicles are indeed green. So this was the impetus of the 2020 report and this update in 2024 to look at what can we say about the life cycle environmental performance of micromobility. And what we can say are these three things. Micromobility is becoming greener, and this is particularly the case for shared micromobility, but micromobility in general is already a very green, low-impact travel option. On the shared fleet side, the design of vehicles has reduced the life cycle impacts as we've moved from off-the-shelf vehicles to purpose-built vehicles. And we can also see that the fleet servicing required for shared micromobility has significantly improved its life cycle profile and reduced impacts. When we talk about micromobility at the ITF, we define micromobility from a safety perspective first. That is, we categorize micromobility by speed and mass, and we have determined that there are these four types of families of micromobility vehicles that are less than 35 kilos, and those that are over than 35 kilos up to 350 kilos, type A and type B. But we've also looked at vehicles that can travel assisted up to 25 kilometers an hour, and then faster micromobility vehicles that can travel with the motor assist for electric assistance up to 45 kilometers an hour. In this report, we are looking only at type A and type C micromobility. These are vehicles that weigh less than 35 kilos and that whose motor assisted speed only goes up to 25 kilometers an hour. We also are looking at the full life cycle impact, not just the operation. And so this life cycle impact is comprised of a number of elements and has four specific areas that we examine in our work. Upstream, we look at the primary and secondary material extraction and processing for the vehicles and the components, but as well looking at the same thing with relation to the energy production for fuels and electricity. We look at the component manufacture, the assembly of the vehicles, vehicles, their transport, and then we break out our findings in these 4 areas. What are the life cycle impacts of the vehicles themselves? What are the life cycle impacts attributable to operations, including the vehicle aspects of the servicing vehicles themselves? We look at the energy use per kilometer and the CO2 impacts relating to that for both for all types of micromobility. And finally, we look at the impacts of infrastructure construction and use. Now, this last one is something that is extremely helpful when looking at very different modes, including ride sourcing, public transport, etc. We've kept it in, even though it's a minimal part of the overall life cycle impact for micromobility, just so that these findings can be compared to our previous work and other work looking at other modes. So I said that we have seen that the life cycle impacts of micromobility are small and dropping. At the one range, at the lowest range, we see private bicycles, shared bicycles, producing about 15 grams of CO2 per rider kilometer, per passenger kilometer, which is quite low indeed. And at the upper end, the forms of micromobility that are shared and that have more servicing operations, we see up to 61 grams of CO2 per rider kilometer for shared e-scooter services. And these are the findings that we look at using the same approach that we did in 2020. Now, to give a point of reference, a half-filled city bus operates at about 42 grams of CO2 per kilometer when it's electric, and about 90 grams of CO2 per kilometer when it's fossil fuel based. And an EU typical fossil fuel car produces about 160 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer and 91 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer for electric cars. So you can see that micromobility in all instances are lower than cars as they're currently being used, especially in the European context, but also are about on par, even for the worst parts of micromobility, the worst performance rather of micromobility with public transport. And that is one main message. But the second message coming out of our work is that we've seen tremendous improvement in the life cycle impacts for shared micromobility in particular. When we look at first generation e-scooters, second generation e-scooters, and current generation e-scooters, there's a significant drop, the same drop that we see for shared e-bikes and shared bicycles. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to kick it over to Pierpaolo, who will go into a little more detail around some of those findings.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And yes, here we have a slide where we go into more details. Here I will focus mostly on the cases that Philippe mentioned, which are those related with the shared forms of micromobility. So they are the first, the second, and further down shared bicycles, but also the leased bicycle, which is a new form of micromobility that we looked into in this update, and we didn't have a chance to cover back in 2020. So the key message here is that the life cycle emissions have been falling when we compare what we calculated now and back in 2020. The fall is significant for the e-scooter, you see it at the top, but also for e-bikes. So e-scooter is about, I would say, 40 to 50% lower than our first estimate. An e-bike in the same ballpark, and so is the case also for shared bicycles. Leased bicycle perform very well, actually outperform shared bicycles in terms of emissions per passenger kilometer. So you may ask yourself, why is this? And we have tried to respond to this question here. So here you have shared e-scooter, shared e-bikes, and shared bicycles, and with elements that have been either increasing or decreasing their emissions, CO2 emissions per passenger kilometer. So as you can see on the left and in the middle, there is an upward effect related with the fact that we have seen during the transition the use of larger batteries. So normally larger batteries have greater amounts of embedded carbon, and so if you use larger batteries, you have an upward effect. You also have an upward effect if you use more materials in general, so that's also relevant to bear in mind. So the redesign of the vehicles, in a way, increases the embedded emissions. At the same time, though, the redesign of the vehicle allows for an increased vehicle life. And so this effect of the lifetime increase is actually stronger than the effect of increasing the amount of materials you need for each of the vehicles. And this is shown in the orange bars. And this is true across the board. So the fact that we are designing the vehicles now, or micromobility companies are designing the vehicles on purpose and not just buying them off the shelf, results in longer vehicle lifetime, which ultimately leads to lower CO2 emissions per passenger kilometer. So that's a very positive development. Other improvements come from enhanced operational services. So if you use battery swapping, for example, you can service more vehicles with the same servicing vehicles. And therefore, you reduce the amount of servicing vehicle kilometers per active kilometer of the vehicle serviced. And so that means at the end, that results in a lower amount of emissions per passenger kilometer. So that's also a positive impact that it contributes to the reduction. The last contribution is in pink, and it's related with the fact that some of the vehicles servicing the micromobility vehicles have moved towards battery electric. And being battery electric, they basically are associated with lower direct emissions. So that's another effect, I would say smaller than the others, but still relevant. Okay, here is in writing a little bit what I said. So what are the key drivers? Longer vehicle lives, more durable and modular vehicle construction. So that all elements that contribute to extending the vehicle lifetime and therefore reducing let's say, the fixed amount of emissions to build the vehicles and ultimately contributing to lower emission overall. There are also signals of greater circularity, certainly greater awareness about micromobility companies, about the importance of these. Secondary materials are less carbon intensive and energy intensive to produce than primary materials. And in sustainability report, there's a clear communication about this. I also mentioned the improved operation, the role of battery swapping as an element that has been enabling that, and the electrification. So these are the key drivers. When it comes to the leasing case, so I mentioned this a couple of slides ago. We looked into leasing because we didn't have a chance to do this back in 2020, and we thought this was a relevant addition to the report. So what our findings essentially point to the fact that thanks to a high ratio of active bikes per service vehicle, leasing ends up being amongst the best performers, outperforming other forms of shared e-bikes. And so we see leased bikes as one of the solutions that have the best, like the lowest CO2 emissions per passenger kilometer, worth considering for wider adoption. In terms of trip substitution, this is an important element that we didn't really have a chance to dive into. So the performance of micromobility at the end depends on what the micromobility can substitute. So whether or not micromobility is effective in abating overall emissions is something that that materializes if, let's say, the alternative choice of transport is a mode that is more carbon intensive on a CO2 emission per passenger kilometer basis, rather than a mode that has a similar carbon intensity or lower. So this is crucial to say that it is important to make sure that as micromobility comes into the mix, it replaces more carbon-intensive modes, in particular car travel within cities. If it only ends up replacing walking or bus travel, then in case of walking, it may actually lead to net increases in emissions. And in the case of bus, it could be something that remains on par. As long as then the bus and the micromobility are taken together in a way that is synergetic, though, this could actually help or strengthen the case for micromobility to displace passenger kilometers on more carbon-intensive modes, in particular cars. So there is an element of combining the two that actually can strengthen the capacity of micromobility to deliver in terms of reducing overall emission. This is important. We'll come back to that. So key recommendations that we have for public authorities are listed here. So the first one is about transparent environmental impact reporting. So requiring this, in essence, what we suggest is that there is a possibility for public authority to require minimum performances for micromobility services, and in building this in, for example, in conditions related with licensing or conditioning. As long as micromobility is treated in a way that is fair with other modes, we think this is a good way forward. It obliges or it confronts everyone with the need to look into the environmental aspect in an effective way, and ultimately we also see opportunities for better economic performances. So environmental and economic performance can go hand in hand. Second point is fostering trust and comparability of impact assessment. So for this, it's important to have transparent and best practice life cycle environmental methodology and LCA methodologies. So we think that with the contribution with this report, we have offered something that can help everyone advance there. There is an Excel file which is entirely transparent associated with the report that essentially shows the way we have approached this, and we think this could be helpful for any public authority interested in fostering this trust and comparability. It's also important that the proper data are collected on the same basis by the different operators, by the different stakeholders. So that's an additional element that will be important for that. Then we suggest supporting impact-based outcomes for micromobility. So this is the idea of, for example, using incentive mechanism or disincentive depending on the environmental impact. We also consider the need to provide adequate parking for micromobility. The reason for this is that adequate parking is actually strengthening the case for micromobility in terms of capacity to displace car travel in our understanding. So this is something that could create better synergies between public transport and micromobility, and therefore ultimately lead to environmental benefits. One more item is ensuring minimum environmental performance standards. So this is something that can essentially set minimum requirements, can complement the transparent environmental impact reporting. It guarantees like minimum performance. It's helpful to also achieve better environmental outcomes. We also suggest leveraging existing approaches to deliver better outcomes for cities. In particular, there's the possibility to use a public service contract to support the deployment of micromobility in a way that is synergetic with public transport. So the existing approaches is public service contracts. The synergy with public transport is something that clearly leads to the better outcome overall. We have three more: reinforcing synergies between micromobility and public transport. This is, I just mentioned, let's say, with the former recommendation, the relevance of these. And one way to achieve that is actually to the facilitation of the integration of micromobility services into what is called mobility as a service. So the idea there is to ensure that there is a greater capacity to access and ensure that there is a good integration between public transportation and micromobility, leveraging the complementarity of the two. Micromobility can be a feeder to public transport, and by doing that, it can replace car travel. Last point is reinforcing minimum data collection and about micromobility and its impacts. We still struggled basically to find available data on, let's say, coherent and comparable basis across different stakeholders. So we think it's important to make an effort to ensure that there's better alignment and data are collected in a way that is coherent across different parts of the world, so that comparability can amongst different modes, but also across different parts of the world, and identification of best practice can be enhanced. I leave to Philippe the next one, which is this one on recommendations for micromobility industry and operators. Thank you.
We're heading into the home stretch, and for those of you who thought only public authorities had to do things, spoiler alert, they have to be accompanied by actions on the part of the micromobility industry and their operators. And so, of course, one of the first things is to continue the efforts that they have already undertaken and ensure that that trend improves over time and doesn't just plateau out. The second one is to monitor the environmental impact of their fleet operations, not just of their vehicles, but the way in which they service the fleet and how that can continue to be improved over time as well. And to do that, to establish these transparent and comparable metrics to track environmental performance using established methodologies, just as public authorities can also incentivize this. On the way in which they can standardize or find ways of publishing data or collecting and publishing data that aligns with how public authorities are actually working with this. There are mechanisms that are available, standard reporting formats, for example, like those that can be built into the mobility data specification. So this is clearly an area where public authorities and other stakeholders can discuss with industry what are these standard reporting frameworks that will ensure that everyone is on the same page. And at the same time, internally setting environmental performance targets and documenting their progress towards meeting those targets, publicizing their progress towards meeting those. And finally, on this last point of creating better material synergies, so the physical linkages between micromobility services, the stocking corrals, the parking corrals, and the public transport services themselves, and the digital integration of these public authorities, of course, benefit from being engaged fully with the micromobility industry and the operators in making those two types of linkages come about, and also be quite effective for engaging people to use both modes. So those are a long set of recommendations that we have put together on the basis of this work. As Ronan and Pierpaolo have alluded to, for those of you who want to wonk out and get into the data, look at the sources, get your hands dirty in our Excel spreadsheet, then link to this link here that'll let you use this spreadsheet, maybe improve it, and then understand how we came about these figures, and also update them as we go along. So with that, I will conclude at least our part of the presentation, and we're happy to get your questions, maybe points of clarification that you'd like to bring up. I will say one last thing. When we looked at both of these aspects, safety and life cycle environmental impact, one of the things that came out of that, both of these, is that we are in a world where people have many more choices to travel, and where it is almost as easy to live without a car as with a car in many of our cities. And so clearly this has been a great boon. It can become better even still.
Thanks indeed, Philippe and Pierpaolo, for quite an in-depth presentation. There's a lot of material in this report. The aim of the game is that we take as many of your questions as possible for our participants. Please use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window, and we can start taking your questions for now. To get the ball rolling, Philippe, as you said, it seems to be almost too good to be true. The environmental impacts are improving, many choices for people who have access to micromobility. However, there are still cities and jurisdictions that do not allow micromobility or have modified their micromobility access, especially for free floating services since the last report in 2020. Would you like to speak, either of you, to that a little bit, as to why some cities are still reticent despite this increasing body of evidence where micromobility is interesting?
I can take a first hit. Maybe Pierpaolo, you can come on the life cycle impacts, or how they're at least viewed by different cities. When we have seen cities that have been reticent or have pulled away from shared micromobility, and keep in mind that we make this distinction between micromobility that people own, so bicycles and scooters that they own, and those that are commercially shared. When we see cities that have moved away or back from shared micromobility, it has often been on the grounds of the occupation of public space and the chaotic occupation of public space, especially when it comes to parking and storing these vehicles. What I can say there is that the two models that we had in the past, so docked versus completely free floating, are no longer really, we're not in that binary world now, because most cities, at least in Europe and many cities in North America and elsewhere, are starting to regulate where shared micromobility vehicles can be dropped off in pens and corrals in specific areas. And so that clutter, that street clutter that accompanied the initial rollout of shared micromobility services is actually becoming much less of a factor. But there are, of course, concerns relating to the environmental performance and the safety performance. I won't speak to the safety issues because we've done that in another report. I welcome you to look online. But Pierpaolo, maybe on some of these environmental aspects, what's different now versus the first generations of shared micromobility vehicles?
Okay, so my take on this is that in essence, we have witnessed a period during which a new industry had a chance to mature and evolve into something that optimize at once. In particular, I would say optimize the economics of rolling out the micromobility vehicles, and by doing that, also managed to enhance the environmental performance. Clearly, if you need to roll out new vehicles every few months, or you end up having to face greater investment costs. Then instead, if you roll out vehicles which are by design lasting longer, then you have greater chances to move towards greater profitability. That comes in a way that is completely aligned with a better environmental performance due to the fact that you have most of the emissions related with the manufacturing, and you can spread them across much greater amount of kilometers. The same applies to the better operations. I mean, rolling out these vehicles in a way that enables to service more of them with the same servicing vehicles, the same amount of servicing vehicles, ultimately leads to lower costs and lower emissions for the servicing activities. And it aligns economics and environment and serves multiple purposes. And so I think what we have witnessed is the transition between a phase where what was most important was really to gain market share to a phase where that is no longer the case, and there has been greater capacity to, well, leverage the acquired position while taking care of the economics and implicitly also of the environmental performance. I must say also cities have evolved, and the way cities have been welcoming or not micromobility vehicles has changed. As you said, Philippe, there's a theme of public space occupation. There's been changes there. We have recommended in the report the use of parking, provision of parking. This is important because it helps addressing the issue of urban space occupation in a way that is not chaotic, and ultimately improves acceptability and also enables better synergetic use of micromobility with public transport, especially if the parking location is strategically located to favor that. Mm-hmm. So this is, although the fact that we are moving towards this change, not exactly docked or dockless, but into something that is somewhere in the middle, I think ends up coming also with greater acceptability opportunities and ultimately is beneficial for everyone. So that's also another important aspect that I think helps understanding what has changed.
Mm-hmm. And Ronan, to the question about how cities look, and I'm just building on this because I see that we don't have another question lined up. How cities look, it's important to understand that even those cities that have banned, for example, the city of Paris banned shared e-scooter operations, so just one component of the whole micromobility offer, that doesn't mean that e-scooters aren't being used in the city. They are being used by individuals, and of course there are a lot of people who use these devices. So the important is, of course, to focus where the greatest impacts are, but also to make sure that the whole range of micromobility is low impact and getting lower impact. But to the point that I made in the very opening slide when we talked about the results, micromobility across the board, shared or not shared, almost always performs better than every other mode of transport in its average capacity, not fully well-used public transport, but in the average use. So it is clearly a beneficial addition to how people can get around cities more quickly, safely when the infrastructure is present, and with less environmental impact.
Thanks indeed, very comprehensive answer. Philippe, you touched on public transport there and the overall choice that citizens have to move around a city. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the conditions under which micromobility works with public transport to improve access and to have lower life cycle environmental impacts?
So public transport or micromobility is an accelerator or an extender of public transport. It can extend on both ends, which means that you can take your device in the public transport vehicle. There are, of course, issues with that at peak hours, and that's why in many cases only folding bikes are allowed in trains and trams and subways, and sometimes not even on buses. But there's also this ability to extend the trip at the outset with a shared service. You take a shared service to the station, to the bus stop, you take your bus, you take your tram, your train, and then you get out and you use another shared device. And so in that way, it extends the range of trips that use public transport. It also makes them, increases the catchment basin for people using public transport. So they don't have to be next to a stop, or they can skip a few bus stops and get to a feeder train or a main line train that's much faster. For that to happen, these kind of parking corrals, parking bays have to be co-situated with stops so that people can drop off their shared micromobility device in a safe and ordered manner near the station and then quickly get on. So there's that physical aspect of interconnectedness that matters. But at the same time, when you're talking about shared services, there's that digital aspect of being able to book a ride from A to B and not have to think about booking three different components, the first leg to the public transport leg, and the final leg. And that goes to the point that Pierpaolo was making, that in fact the ITF has done a lot of work on how do you create a mobility as a service ecosystem that enables this to happen. I'll send you to this report called Mix and Mass, where you can see some of our thinking on that. And we have a big report coming out soon that builds on work that we've done in the Brussels capital region, looking at the specific operational aspects of creating an environment where you can mix and match different modes, including micromobility.
Okay, thank you very much. In your presentation, you touched on the fact that where people are coming from and switching to micromobility sometimes can actually increase the emissions. There's a question from Jack Crawford, who says that it's been said that the convenience and novelty of micromobility devices can encourage people to make trips that would not otherwise have been taken. So Jack asks, has this been proven, and is it considered in the life cycle emissions compared to conventional modes, cars, bus, or private bicycle? Who'd like to answer that question? And keep your questions coming in, please, using the Q&A function. Thank you.
Go ahead, Pierpaolo, and I can add something.
Okay, I can try. So there is actually one of the pages of the report. It's page 15, where we report a table on model trip substitution, and this includes a column called new trips. So it is true that the presence of micromobility devices, the convenience, has led to an increase of basically taking some trips that wouldn't have otherwise been taken. It's documented. We quoted different references regarding that. So if you only take that in isolation, inevitably this comes with a net increase in terms of emissions, because those trips would have been zero emissions, not being taken, not requiring any vehicle. The point is, does it make sense to take that in isolation? So that is part of different services that are offered by these micromobility vehicles. So I would say not taking that in isolation, but considering that alongside the replacement of other trips. I mean, the same can be said by replacing walking. If you replace walking, you need a micromobility vehicle. That is a net addition of emissions. So this is why we're stressing the importance of linking this up with public transport, ensuring that we find ways to leverage the fact that micromobility vehicles across different transport vehicles tend to have low CO2 emissions per passenger kilometer, to enhance the offer of alternatives to more carbon-intensive ways of moving around, which are typically traveling by car or traveling by taxi or ride sourcing, especially in services which are not shared. Mm-hmm. So that's the idea. The combination is, I would say, net positive, as Philippe has been arguing. I think that this is indeed the case. It depends then on specific details, whether or not, for example, public transport is all running on very low carbon electricity. So this may change the balance, but ultimately what really matters is, can these vehicles displace more carbon intensive travel, and while doing so, can this overall, including the increased amount of trips, end up in lower emissions? And I think the answer is yes. We think this is a possibility, especially if we use this synergetic deployment, mutually strengthening micromobility and public transportation.
Thanks indeed, Pierpaolo. Just launching a quick poll to let us know if you find these sessions useful or not. That will help us to improve in the future. Keep your questions coming in using the Q&A function in your Zoom window. There's a question on a different environmental aspect, that of localized air pollution. Can you speak to micromobility's influence on this type of pollution, please?
Pierpaolo.
Yeah, so we have a page on that in the report. We haven't gone in depth on that topic, but generally speaking, we're talking about light vehicles that do not emit directly local pollutant emission. The local pollutant emissions are associated with manufacturing of these vehicles to a large extent. We're talking about vehicles which are increasingly serviced by zero-emission vehicles, because it's convenient. If you have a high rate of utilization, you want to adopt vehicles with zero direct emissions, so basically electrified vehicles to service them. It's cost effective. So generally speaking, our take is that when it comes to emissions of local pollutants, it is highly likely that the end result will be a net benefit from the deployment of micromobility. Again, whether this is a net benefit depends on what replaces what. So there is a need to make sure that micromobility vehicles are deployed in a way that removes vehicles that are more intensive when it comes to emissions of NOx and particulate matter. And so better, of course, if a micromobility vehicles electrified replaces let's say personal travel on a heavy car or heavy ride sourcing vehicle used in a way that doesn't include any ride sharing. So
I would point out one other thing, that is, as fleets, overall fleets, car fleets, van fleets, micromobility fleets become increasingly electrified, the balance of air pollution that comes from combustion decreases vis-a-vis the balance of air pollution, especially particulate matter, suspended fine particulate matter that comes from braking, so from brake pads and brake disc particles and rubber and tire compounds. And as these are lighter vehicles, both the amount of particle shedding in braking and the amount of particle shedding from the rubber and the tires is much lower. So again, the sources of emissions, the balance of sources of fine particulate emissions are shifting. They are lower, but they're changing in nature. And in a fully electrified world, these devices, the smaller light devices, will pollute less of those residual types of air suspended fine particulate matter in the air.
Thanks indeed. There's still time for a few more questions. Don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A function. Brendan Hill has a question on the calculation of the life cycle assessment. So Brendan states that it's not uncommon for a durably built, privately owned vehicle to last for decades, to which I can attest if it doesn't get stolen. And Brendan asks, do your figures for their range of emissions take into account this type of lifespan variability, i.e. the likely long tail of ultra-low emission mobility?
Okay, I can take this. So I fully agree. There's a big variability. It really depends. Some bicycles last for decades and they rust in the yard, and some other bicycles last for decades, but they are used very actively by their owner, and so the kilometers driven by the same bicycle can actually change quite a bit over the year. So during those decades, it really depends on the usage profiles. Whether or not essentially the bicycle can be low emission or can be very low emission per passenger kilometer. So we have let's say we were forced to try to simplify, and so we tried to look for representative values, for example, using data from cycling federations or representative for, like, let's say, bicycle manufacturers or bicycle component manufacturers that reflected, let's say, average usage profiles and average lifetimes for privately owned bicycles. And we didn't get into, let's say, dissecting all the possible alternatives in terms of use cases for specific, very case-specific uses of privately owned bicycle. But the general rule is if a privately owned bicycle is used a lot, emissions go down significantly. If it rusts in the yard, it's a net addition because you end up having to manufacture it without really delivering any, switching away from any other kind of modes of transport. So it's entirely dependent on the profile, the usage profile.
I would just say that, of course, we're talking about smaller vehicles, and generally, they're the three L's that matter here. Is it light? Is it low powered? And is it long lasting? And if you're answering yes to all of those, then you have a more environmentally friendly vehicle.
Okay, very good. Thanks very much for those comprehensive answers. We have no more questions. We're going to wrap up the session right there. I sincerely thank Philippe, Crist, and Pierpaolo Cazzola for their input for this great report. Please peruse it. As we mentioned, the Excel sheets are there for your use to use calculations on the report page. It's in the chat summary. Our next Ask the Author, I hope you'll join us as well, is on our Urban Logistics Hubs coming up on the 23rd of July, excuse me. And there's a link to that in the chat and a few ways to stay in touch with us via subscriptions and social media. So thank you very much to all our participants. Thank you very much to our lead authors, and we'll see you soon online. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.